He was faster than everyone. He dribbled like a magician. He scored goals that left the world speechless. At just 17 years old, he was breaking records at FC Barcelona, surpassing even Lionel Messi in the youth ranks. The headlines were clear. The next Messi has arrived. The pressure was immense, but so was the talent. Bojan Krkic was supposed to be a legend, a name that would echo through football history alongside the greatest of all time. But something went horribly wrong. Where is Bojan Krkic today? Once considered the future of Spanish football, he has disappeared from the spotlight, his name barely mentioned among football's elite. A player who had everything: talent, technique, intelligence, now finds himself forgotten by the very sport that once embraced him. What happened? How did a prodigy, blessed with the skills to dominate the game, vanish from football's biggest stages? The weight of expectations in football is unbearable for many, but for Bojan, it became suffocating. As a teenager, he carried the hopes of millions, expected to be Barcelona's next great superstar. Yet behind the goals, behind the trophies, behind the promise of an unstoppable career, there was something no one saw. A silent battle, a struggle that no amount of talent could overcome. The story of Bojan Krkic is not just about a failed footballer. It is about the cruel reality of modern football, how pressure, anxiety, and the relentless demands of the sport can break even the most gifted players. His journey is a warning, a reminder that talent alone is never enough. Because in football, the greatest enemies are often not the opponents on the pitch, but the demons inside one's own mind. He was compared to Messi. He was labeled as the next Spanish football icon. But today, his career is nothing more than a distant memory. How did everything fall apart so quickly? Was it a single mistake, a series of wrong choices, or something much deeper? Something that football refuses to acknowledge? Stay until the end of this video, because the truth behind Bojan Krkic's downfall will shock you. And by the time you finish watching, you'll realize that this could happen to any young football star. Bojan Krkic was not just another promising talent. He was the name that echoed through the corridors of La Masia, Barcelona's legendary youth academy. His touch on the ball was mesmerizing, his movements fluid, his goals nothing short of breathtaking. Coaches, scouts, and football analysts whispered in awe. This was the player destined to take over the throne. Not just another great talent, but the next Messi. From the very first time he set foot in La Masia, it was clear that Bojan was different. He wasn't just good, he was a phenomenon. The ball seemed glued to his feet, his dribbles left defenders helpless, and his instinct in front of goal was unnatural. By the age of 16, he had already shattered every scoring record in Barcelona's academy, surpassing even the numbers Messi had posted during his time there. 126 goals in just 30 games. It was unheard of. The club knew they had something special, something beyond ordinary. And so did the world. The hype surrounding Bojan Krkic wasn't built overnight. It was a storm that grew stronger with every match, every highlight, every ridiculous stat that surfaced. Spanish football needed a new icon, someone to carry the torch, and Bojan fit the mold perfectly. The comparisons were inevitable. He wasn't just seen as Messi's successor. Some dared to say he might even surpass the Argentine in brilliance. His low center of gravity, quick dribbling, and insane finishing ability mirrored Messi's playstyle so closely that it was almost eerie. And then it happened. April 2007. Barcelona was facing Villarreal, and a 16-year-old Bojan was called up to the senior squad. The buzz was electric. His moment had come, and when he finally stepped onto the field, the Camp Nou erupted, a boy among men. Yet he played as if he belonged there. His debut wasn't just a formality. It was the beginning of what was supposed to be an era. The youngest player ever to debut for Barcelona. Even Messi hadn't done that. Then came the first goal. A moment that would forever be engraved in the history of Barcelona. September 2007. Against Osasuna, Bojan became the youngest player to score for Barca in La Liga, breaking yet another record, and proving that his talent wasn't just a rumor, it was real. The greats of the game took notice. Xavi, Iniesta, and even Thierry Henry saw something special in him. They praised his intelligence, his movement, his ability to see the game differently. Guardiola, the mastermind behind Barcelona's golden era, spoke highly of him, seeing in Bojan the DNA of the club, a player who could define the future. The fans fell in love. Every time he touched the ball, there was anticipation. Every goal he scored was a glimpse into what could be, a legend in the making. But behind the scenes, something dark was already taking shape. The weight of expectation was crushing, the pressure unbearable. Bojan was still a teenager, barely a kid, and yet he was being placed on a pedestal that very few in football history had ever reached. The world wanted the next Messi. They wanted the next Maradona. But what if he wasn't ready? What if no one was? The spotlight can be a dream for some, but for others, it is a slow, suffocating nightmare. Bojan smiled for the cameras. He celebrated with his teammates. He spoke confidently in interviews. But deep inside, a storm was growing. A pressure that didn't just exist on the pitch, but followed him home, into his private life, into his thoughts. Every match, every performance, every mistake was dissected. Every goal was another expectation. Every moment he didn't shine was a sign of doubt. And doubt in football is deadly. The media didn't help. Headlines screamed, Bojan, the next Messi. Better than Messi at his age. Barcelona's future is here. There was no escape. It was no longer about playing football. It was about proving, game after game, that he was exactly what they said he was. And that kind of pressure, it's the kind that breaks players. Even his body started betraying him. Small injuries started creeping in. The exhaustion of trying to meet expectations took a toll, and yet the world didn't care. They wanted more. More goals. More magic. More records. There was no room for struggle. No room for a pause. No room for failure. And then, something happened. Something that would mark the beginning of his silent downfall. It was subtle at first, hardly noticeable to anyone outside the club, but Bojan felt it. A change, a shift. The dream was beginning to crack, and what happened next would change everything. Before we continue this shocking story, make sure to hit that like button if you're enjoying the video so far. This is just the beginning, and what's coming next will reveal the hidden truth behind Bojan Krkic's downfall. Keep watching, because you won't believe what happened next. The world of football has always been hungry for the next big thing. The next Ronaldo, the next Maradona, the next Messi, and for a brief moment, Bojan Krkic was that name. The golden boy destined to take over Barcelona and lead a new generation of dominance. The hype was unstoppable, fueled by the media, the fans, and even those within the club. Every goal he scored, every dribble that left defenders frozen, was another reason to believe that he wasn't just good, he was extraordinary. But there was a problem no one wanted to acknowledge. What happens when a teenager is handed a crown before he's ready to wear it? The comparisons to Messi weren't just frequent, they were suffocating. The journalists wrote about it, the commentators echoed it, the fans demanded it, and soon, it became more than just a conversation. It became a weight, one that grew heavier with each passing game. No one cared that Messi and Bojan were completely different players, that their styles, their personalities, their paths were never meant to align so perfectly. None of that mattered, because the world had already decided. Bojan was the heir. He didn't get to choose. Pressure is a strange thing. For some, it fuels ambition, turning good players into legends. But for others, it creeps in like a shadow, tightening its grip until there's no air left to breathe. Bojan, despite all his talent, was still a teenager, and while Messi had been allowed time to grow, to adapt, to evolve at his own pace, Bojan was given no such luxury. The moment he set foot in the first team, he was expected to deliver. Every game was a test, every mistake a reason for doubt, and doubt is the deadliest opponent of all. The media's obsession with him reached unbearable levels. Every newspaper, every sports channel, every pundit had an opinion. Some praised him, calling him Barcelona's future. Others, the more ruthless voices, questioned if he was really worthy of the hype. Is he truly the next Messi? Does he have what it takes? Or is he just another overhyped wonder kid? The questions never stopped. They followed him home. They echoed in his mind. And then came the breaking point, the moment where everything changed. The 2008 Champions League semi-final, Barcelona versus Manchester United. The stage was massive. The world was watching. And Bojan, after an incredible season, had earned his place in the squad. He wasn't just there to participate. He was ready. Or at least, that's what everyone believed. The match was tight, suffocatingly intense. Barcelona needed a goal, needed a hero. And all eyes turned to Bojan. Guardiola had trusted him before. The fans had seen his magic. This was it, his moment, the chance to prove that he belonged among the greats. But something was wrong. As the minutes passed, as the tension grew, Bojan could feel it. A crushing, unbearable weight pressing down on his chest. His breathing was uneven, his vision blurred. The crowd, the expectations, the moment. It was too much. It wasn't nerves. It was something far worse. Panic. A feeling so overwhelming, so paralyzing, that it consumed him entirely. He couldn't move. He couldn't think. The world around him faded into a blur of noise and chaos. His mind screamed at him to breathe, to calm down, but his body refused to listen. He had never felt this before, never experienced anything so terrifying. It wasn't an injury. It wasn't exhaustion. It was his own mind betraying him at the worst possible moment. And then, the unthinkable happened. Guardiola made the call. Bojan, the boy wonder, the next Messi, was left out of the squad. He wouldn't play in the most important game of his career. Not because he wasn't good enough, not because he wasn't ready, but because he physically couldn't handle it. The headlines the next day weren't kind. Some called it a last-minute tactical decision. Others speculated that he had been injured. But behind closed doors, the truth was known. Bojan Krkic, the golden boy of Barcelona, had suffered a full-blown anxiety attack that forced him out of the Champions League semi-final. And from that moment on, nothing would ever be the same again. The night before the Champions League semi-final, Bojan Krkic should have been preparing for the biggest game of his life. This was the stage every footballer dreamed of, the kind of match that could define a career. A full Camp Nou, millions watching, the weight of a legendary club resting on every player's shoulders. But for Bojan, the pressure wasn't just a feeling, it was a force, crushing him from the inside out. He had spent years being groomed for this moment, hearing the endless comparisons to Messi, reading the headlines that declared him the future of Barcelona. Now, everything came down to this one night. If he played well, he could solidify his place in history. If he failed, well, failure wasn't an option. But something felt wrong. The anxiety that had been growing inside him for months, maybe even years, was no longer just a quiet whisper in the back of his mind. It was roaring now, a suffocating grip that made it hard to breathe, hard to think. His heart was racing, his body felt heavy. And as much as he tried to convince himself that it was just nerves, that he'd be fine once he stepped onto the pitch, a deep fear gnawed at him. What if I can't do this? That fear wouldn't go away. It only got worse. By the time the team meeting ended, Bojan was barely holding it together. His hands trembled, his chest felt like it was being squeezed, and a terrifying realization hit him. This wasn't just pre-game jitters. This was something else, something he couldn't control. His mind was spiraling, and no matter how hard he tried to suppress it, the panic took over. Bojan Krkic, Barcelona's golden boy, was having a full-blown panic attack on the eve of the most important match of his life. He couldn't hide it anymore. The coaching staff noticed something was wrong. He was pale, distant, barely responding. Some thought he was sick, others assumed it was exhaustion. But those closest to him knew better. The pressure had finally cracked him. The boy who had been carrying the impossible weight of expectations since he was a teenager had reached his breaking point. And then, the final blow came. Pep Guardiola made the call. Bojan was out of the squad. Just like that. No discussion, no second chances. He wouldn't even be on the bench. The club didn't want to take the risk, didn't want to field a player who wasn't mentally prepared for a game of this magnitude. In their eyes, it was a tactical decision. For Bojan, it felt like exile. The next day, the team took the field against Manchester United without him. The cameras focused on Messi, on Xavi, on the superstars who carried Barcelona's hopes. But in the background, somewhere in the shadows, Bojan sat alone, watching his dreams slip further and further away. He should have been out there. He should have been proving to the world that he belonged at this level. Instead, he was drowning in self-doubt, trapped in a nightmare of his own making. After the match, questions started circulating. Why wasn't Bojan in the squad? Was he injured? Had Guardiola lost faith in him? The club's official statement was vague, offering no real explanation. But behind closed doors, the truth was clear. Bojan's battle wasn't with an opponent on the pitch. It was with his own mind. His teammates could see it. Some of them had witnessed glimpses of his struggle before, subtle signs that most ignored. Xavi later admitted that Bojan had always been different, quieter, more affected by the weight of expectation than others. While players like Messi thrived under pressure, Bojan carried it like a burden, and it was slowly suffocating him. Others, like Iniesta, understood all too well what he was going through. Years later, Iniesta would speak openly about his own struggles with depression, about how the loneliness of professional football could eat away at even the strongest players. But back then, mental health wasn't something football addressed. There was no support system, no real discussion. Players were expected to be warriors, to fight through pain, to never show weakness. And so, Bojan did what every footballer was taught to do. He buried it. The problem was, once a crack appears, it only spreads. And for Bojan, the damage had already been done. This was the moment everything changed. The moment the doubts became louder than the belief. The moment he stopped feeling like a prodigy and started feeling like a fraud. He told himself he could bounce back, that this was just a temporary setback. But deep down, a fear had taken root, a fear that wouldn't let go. What if he was never as good as they said? What if he was never meant to be the next Messi? What if this was just the beginning of the end? When Pep Guardiola took over as Barcelona's head coach, it was supposed to be a new beginning for the club, a golden era that would define modern football. But for Bojan Krkic, it marked the beginning of the end. Guardiola's philosophy, his tactical precision, his relentless demand for perfection. These were the foundations that would shape one of the greatest teams in history. Yet, despite Bojan's undeniable talent, despite his years of being groomed as the club's next superstar, something shifted. He wasn't the same player anymore. And more importantly, he wasn't the same in Guardiola's eyes. There were whispers that Guardiola didn't fully trust Bojan, that his game wasn't sharp enough, that his mentality wasn't strong enough, that he didn't fit into the system Guardiola was crafting. But the truth was more complex. Bojan wasn't just struggling on the pitch. He was fighting an invisible battle within himself. The panic attacks, the suffocating weight of expectations, the constant comparisons to Messi, it was all still there, clawing at him, leaving him restless, anxious, and disconnected. He tried to push through. He trained harder. He told himself this was just a phase, that he could still prove himself. But the moments that once came effortlessly, the quick turns, the instinctive finishing, the fearless dribbles, now felt forced. He hesitated more. His movements weren't as fluid. And worst of all, he was losing confidence in himself. He had already felt the sting of exclusion when he was left out of the Champions League squad. Now, with Guardiola fully in charge, he felt himself slipping further into the shadows. At first, he still got chances. He was rotated into the squad, started some matches, scored a few goals, but the consistency was gone. He wasn't the focal point. He wasn't Messi. And in a team that was rapidly becoming the greatest of all time, there was no room for uncertainty, no room for second-guessing. You were either world-class, or you were forgotten. Then came the moment that made it clear. The 2011 Champions League final. Barcelona faced Manchester United at Wembley, and it was a masterclass. Messi, Xavi, Iniesta, Busquets, all at their peak. The world watched in awe as Barcelona dismantled United, proving once again that this team was untouchable. But Bojan, he wasn't even on the bench. He wasn't part of this victory. That was it. That was when he knew. Whatever chance he thought he had to reclaim his place, to be the future of Barcelona, was gone. Guardiola had built something extraordinary, something that didn't include him. He had no future at Barcelona. The decision was made. He needed to leave, needed to start over. A fresh start, away from the pressure, away from the expectations. And so, in the summer of 2011, Bojan Krkic left his boyhood club and signed with AS Roma. At first, it felt like a real second chance. Roma wasn't Barcelona. The media pressure wasn't as suffocating. The expectations weren't as overwhelming. The club was ambitious, but not built around an impossibly high standard like the one he had left behind. And in his early days there, it showed. He played with more freedom, more energy. There were glimpses of the old Bojan, the one who played instinctively, without fear. But then, the cycle repeated. The inconsistency returned. His confidence wavered. And soon, his minutes on the pitch started shrinking. The same doubts that haunted him in Barcelona began creeping back into his mind. Maybe it wasn't the club. Maybe it wasn't the pressure. Maybe it was him. By the end of his first season in Italy, Roma had already lost patience. They sent him to AC Milan, hoping a different environment would reignite his spark. But Milan was in turmoil, struggling to maintain the dominance they once had. The team lacked stability. The squad was changing constantly, and Bojan, he was just another player passing through. No longer a golden boy. No longer a priority. Just another lost talent, trying to stay relevant. From there, the spiral continued. Loaned back to Barcelona for a brief, unremarkable return, then sent to Ajax, where he was supposed to dominate a weaker league, rebuild his confidence, and find himself again. But the same pattern emerged. He was good, but not great. Talented, but not decisive. The next Messi? Not even close. Then came the move that all but sealed his fate, Stoke City. A club far removed from the bright lights of Barcelona. A world away from the Champions League nights at the Camp Nou. The English Premier League was a brutal, unforgiving place. A league built on power, speed, and physicality. And Bojan, a player whose game was based on finesse and technique, was never built for it. At first, it seemed like it might work. The fans adored him. He had moments of brilliance. But this wasn't the stage for him. The football was too direct, too aggressive. The mental scars from years of disappointment hadn't faded. The self-doubt, the anxiety. The feeling that he wasn't enough, it was still there. And once again, just like before, his time on the pitch began to dwindle. The story was repeating itself. Bojan Krkic had gone from being Barcelona's future to a forgotten name, drifting from club to club, searching for something he would never find. But why? Why had someone with so much talent, so much promise, never managed to truly succeed? Was it just bad luck? Poor career choices? Or was there something deeper? Something that had been there since the very beginning? A battle he never truly won? When Bojan Krkic left Barcelona, he thought he was escaping the weight of expectation, the suffocating comparisons, the pressure that had nearly crushed him. He believed that, with the right opportunity, he could still prove himself, that the talent that had once made him the brightest star in La Masia hadn't disappeared. He had convinced himself that his struggles weren't about his ability, but about circumstances. Wrong timing, wrong tactics, wrong teams. He just needed the right place, the right system, the right moment. And for a brief second, it looked like he had found it. A return to Spain was on the table. A fresh start, a chance to play in a league that suited his style, where he could rebuild his confidence away from the brutal, physical nature of the Premier League. Clubs in La Liga were interested. There was talk of a move that would have put him back in an environment where he could thrive, where his technical ability and intelligence would be assets rather than liabilities. But then, Bojan made a decision that changed everything. Instead of returning to Spain, he chose Stoke City. It was a move that made no sense. Stoke was a club known for its aggressive, no-nonsense style of play. A team built around strength, endurance, and long balls rather than the fluid, technical football that Bojan had spent his entire life mastering. The Premier League was ruthless, a place where even the most talented players could disappear if they weren't ready to fight for every ball, to sprint for 90 minutes, to take hit after hit and keep going. And yet, he convinced himself this was the right move. Maybe he wanted to prove something, not just to the world, but to himself. Maybe he wanted to show that he could adapt, that he could survive in an environment that wasn't designed for him. At first, it seemed like it might work. The fans adored him. His technique was unlike anything Stoke had seen before, and for a while, it looked like he had finally found a home. He scored goals, he played with confidence, he had moments where the old magic returned. But the cracks were still there, hidden just beneath the surface. The pressure, the doubt, the mental battles, none of it had truly disappeared. And in the Premier League, there was no room for hesitation. The game in England was different, faster, more chaotic. Bojan was a player who relied on rhythm, on fluidity, on time and space to create. But in the Premier League, there was no time, no space. Every touch had to be perfect. Every movement had to be precise. And for a player whose confidence had already been shattered, it was a disaster waiting to happen. Then came the injuries. The first one wasn't catastrophic, but it was enough to shake him. A torn ligament in his knee, forcing him to the sidelines. A few months of recovery. But when he returned, something was different. The explosiveness, the agility, it wasn't the same. And in a league where you had to be at 110% every second, even the slightest drop in performance was enough to push a player to the fringes. The coaching staff started losing trust. His minutes on the pitch became inconsistent. And once again, the same story began to repeat itself. Fewer starts, more time on the bench, a loss of rhythm, a loss of confidence. The more he tried to force his way back, the worse it got. Stoke, a club that had once seemed like a fresh start, had now become just another chapter in his downfall. Football is cruel. One moment you're celebrated, the next you're forgotten. And as Bojan sat on the bench, watching games from the sidelines, he felt it happening again. The world was moving on. The next Messi had become an afterthought. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. He was supposed to be a legend. He was supposed to be at the top, fighting for titles, playing in Champions League finals. But instead, he was fading. And this time, there was no way back. So now, the question remains, was it his fault? Did Bojan make the wrong choices, sabotage his own career with decisions that never made sense? Or was he just another victim of a football system that chews up young talents and spits them out when they're no longer useful? Let us know in the comments. Was Bojan Krkic a wasted talent, or was he doomed from the start? And if you're enjoying this deep dive into football's lost legends, don't forget to subscribe, because the next story is even more shocking than this one. There are battles in football that are easy to see. A striker facing a towering defender, a goalkeeper staring down a penalty kick in the final seconds of a match, a team fighting against the clock, desperate for one last goal. But there's another kind of battle, one that happens in silence, behind closed doors, away from the roaring crowds and flashing cameras. And this was the battle that Bojan Krkic fought every single day. For years, he had carried the weight of being Barcelona's next great prodigy, the pressure of being called the next Messi, the expectations of millions who believed he was destined for footballing immortality. But no one saw what that pressure was doing to him. No one saw how it crept into his mind, tightening its grip with each passing day, until it became unbearable. Bojan's struggles weren't physical. They weren't injuries that could be treated with surgery or months of rehabilitation. His battles were happening inside him, in a place that football wasn't ready to acknowledge. He suffered from crippling anxiety attacks, moments where his own body betrayed him, where his breathing became erratic, his heart pounded uncontrollably, and his vision blurred. It wasn't something he could just shake off. It wasn't something that could be fixed with more training or tactical adjustments. This was deeper, more insidious. This was something that football didn't understand. For years, he hid it. He buried it beneath a mask of confidence, forcing himself to smile in interviews, to act like everything was fine. He didn't dare show weakness, because in football, weakness wasn't tolerated. The sport was built on resilience, on mental toughness, on the idea that the best players could handle anything. There was no room for doubt, no space for fear. And so Bojan tried to convince himself that he could keep going, that he could fight through it, that he could be what the world expected him to be. But the truth always finds a way out. Years later, after the headlines had faded, after the world had moved on, Bojan finally spoke openly about what he had been through. He admitted that the pressure had broken him, that the anxiety had been suffocating, that during his time at Barcelona, there were moments when he couldn't even leave his house because of the sheer panic that overwhelmed him. He revealed that he had suffered his first major anxiety attack before the 2008 Champions League semi-final, a game that could have defined his career. But instead, it became the night where everything unraveled. In that moment, Bojan wasn't thinking about tactics or game plans. He wasn't thinking about marking defenders or making runs behind the back line. He was just trying to breathe, just trying to stop the world from spinning, just trying to hold himself together. And yet, no one understood. At the time, football had no space for mental health discussions. Anxiety wasn't seen as a legitimate reason for a player to miss a game. If you weren't physically injured, you were expected to play. No one talked about the psychological toll of the sport, the way that pressure could crush young talents before they even had the chance to reach their full potential. Players were expected to be warriors, to endure, to never let emotions affect their performances. And so, when Bojan couldn't step onto the pitch that night, the world didn't ask why. They didn't wonder if maybe there was something deeper happening. Instead, they moved on, labeling it as a tactical decision, an ordinary squad rotation. The club didn't explain. The media didn't investigate. and Bojan was left alone with his demons. Years later, when he finally told the truth, it was almost too late. The football world had already decided his fate. He was no longer the next Messi, no longer a prodigy, no longer a name that carried any weight. He had been forgotten. But what if football had been different back then? What if the sport had recognized that mental health was just as important as physical conditioning? What if there had been structures in place to help players deal with the suffocating weight of expectation? Specialists who have studied the psychology of elite athletes have said that football is one of the most mentally demanding sports on the planet. The pressure to perform, the relentless scrutiny, the fear of failure, it all builds up layer by layer until it breaks even the strongest minds. Some players find ways to cope, others don't. Bojan was one of the latter. Today, the conversation around mental health in football has changed. Players like Andres Iniesta have spoken openly about their struggles with depression. Stars like Jesse Lingard and Dani Olmo have revealed how anxiety nearly destroyed their careers. Even Messi, the very man Bojan was compared to, has admitted that the pressure of football can be overwhelming. But back then, back when Bojan was at the peak of his career, desperately trying to hold himself together, no one was ready to listen. So now we ask you, is football responsible for what happened to Bojan? Did the system fail him, pushing him too hard, too soon, without offering the support he needed? Or was he simply never meant for this world? Never built to survive in the ruthless reality of professional football? Let us know in the comments. Do you think football destroys young talents before they ever get the chance to succeed? And if you're new here, make sure to subscribe, because the next story we have for you might be even more shocking than this one. There comes a moment in every footballer's career when they realize the dream is slipping away. For some, it happens gradually, a slow decline masked by diminishing performances and fading relevance. For others, it happens in a single brutal instant. One moment of clarity where they understand beyond any doubt that they will never stand at the top again. For Bojan Krkic, that moment came too soon. Once the boy who shattered records at La Masia, who carried the weight of Barcelona's future on his young shoulders, Bojan now found himself drifting. Club after club, league after league, he was chasing something that no longer seemed within reach. From the Champions League to football's forgotten corners, his fall was both tragic and inevitable. After his disastrous spell at Stoke City, Bojan knew he needed a fresh start. He had tasted the brutality of English football, the relentless physicality that suffocated his style, the speed and intensity that punished hesitation. He had tried to fight against it, to prove that technique and intelligence could overcome brute force. But in the end, he had lost. Now, he just wanted to play football again. He wanted to feel the game the way he had as a child, before the expectations, before the comparisons, before the crushing weight of being the next Messi. But where do you go when Europe no longer believes in you? The answer came in the form of an unexpected offer from the MLS, a league that for years had been considered a graveyard for European stars past their prime, a place where careers ended rather than thrived. But Bojan was only in his late 20s. This wasn't supposed to be his final destination. He convinced himself that this was a stepping stone, a place where he could rebuild his confidence, rediscover his joy, and return stronger than ever. He signed for CF Montreal, a club far removed from the bright lights of La Liga or the intensity of the Premier League. The expectations were lower, the pressure less suffocating. And for a brief moment, it seemed like this might work. He played with more freedom. He wasn't burdened by the same relentless scrutiny, and he even showed flashes of the player he had once been. But something was missing. This wasn't the elite level. This wasn't what he had dreamed of as a child. He had gone from competing against the best in the world to playing in a league where the intensity, the stakes, the very essence of football felt different. It wasn't that the MLS lacked quality. It was that, deep down, Bojan knew he wasn't supposed to be here. The hunger that had once driven him started to fade. He wasn't fighting to prove himself anymore. He wasn't striving to become one of the greatest. Now, he was just trying to stay relevant, to hold on to a career that had already slipped through his fingers. Then came the move to Japan, another attempt to reignite something that had long since burned out. He signed with Vissel Kobe, joining a league where many European players had gone in search of one last payday, one final chapter before retirement. He played alongside Andres Iniesta, his former Barcelona teammate, a living legend who had found a second life in Japan. But for Bojan, this wasn't a second life. It was a quiet farewell. The game no longer felt the same. The fire that had once burned inside him had dimmed. He had spent too many years running from the ghosts of what could have been, too many years trying to escape the crushing realization that he had never truly recovered from his early fall. And then one day it hit him, the moment of absolute clarity. He was never coming back. He would never again play on football's biggest stages, never again hear the Champions League anthem while standing among the world's best, never again wear the Barcelona shirt and feel like the future of football. It was over. Not officially, not yet, but in his heart, he knew. From a child prodigy at Barcelona to a forgotten name in Japan, the fall was complete. But what went so wrong? Was it just bad luck? Poor career choices? Or had Bojan Krkic been doomed from the very beginning? There was no grand farewell, no packed stadium chanting his name, no final standing ovation, no emotional speech as he walked off the pitch for the last time. When Bojan Krkic decided to retire, the football world barely noticed. A simple announcement, a few scattered headlines, a handful of fans reminiscing about what could have been, and then silence. For most footballers, retirement is a moment of reflection, a time to celebrate a career filled with triumphs and failures, highs and lows. But for Bojan, it felt different. It felt like a whisper in a world that had already forgotten him. There was no media frenzy, no deep retrospectives about his journey, no flood of tributes from teammates and rivals alike. A player who once carried the impossible weight of expectation had slipped away from the game he had dedicated his entire life to, and few even paused to acknowledge it. At just 32 years old, he decided to walk away, not because of injury, not because of age, but because the fire that had once burned inside him had long since gone out. His career had become a series of desperate attempts to find something that no longer existed, to reclaim a version of himself that had disappeared years ago. The prodigy, the wonder kid, the next Messi, that player had been gone for a long time. All that remained was the shadow of what he was supposed to be. There was no farewell match, no Legends tribute, no viral moment of nostalgia flooding social media. Bojan Krkic, once the most promising young talent in the world, had retired in complete obscurity. Perhaps the most painful part of his departure wasn't that he retired young. It was that so few people cared. When players like Xavi, Iniesta, and Messi eventually left Barcelona, the world stopped to honor them. When Cristiano Ronaldo and Zlatan Ibrahimovic retire, it will be front-page news. Even players who never reached that elite level often get their moment. A heartfelt goodbye, a recognition of what they contributed to the game. But Bojan, he faded into the background, just like his career had. This is the brutal reality of football. It is a machine that never stops, never slows down. It builds idols and discards them with equal speed. The game has no patience for nostalgia unless it's about legends who conquered it. For everyone else, there is no mercy. A young star emerges, and the cycle begins again. There is always another Bojan, another prodigy, to take his place, another promise to chase the dream that he could never fully grasp. The football world moves on quickly. It always does. And that might be the most painful truth of all. Bojan Krkic was not a nobody. He was not an average player who faded quietly because he was never good enough. He was a record breaker, a prodigy, a name that once carried immense weight. He had been compared to Messi, had been trusted to carry the future of one of the greatest clubs in the world. He had played alongside legends, lifted trophies, experienced the highs of football that most players could only dream of. And yet, when the end came, he was left with nothing but memories of what could have been. There were no cameras capturing his last moments on the pitch, no global outpouring of appreciation for his journey. For years, he had fought to stay relevant, moving from league to league, club to club, trying to recapture the magic that once seemed so natural to him. But as time passed, even he began to understand, some things are lost forever. Football had given him everything, and then just as quickly it had taken it all away. Maybe he had expected a different ending. Maybe there was a part of him that still believed, deep down, that one final chance would come, that he would have one last moment under the lights, one last goal that made the world remember who he was. But that chance never arrived. And so, when he finally made the decision to retire, it felt less like closing a chapter and more like letting go of a dream that had been slipping through his fingers for years. He had given everything to the sport, and in return, the sport had moved on without him. But should he have been forgotten so easily? Football prides itself on celebrating its heroes. It immortalizes those who define eras, who lift trophies, who leave behind legacies that last for generations. But what about those who don't? What about those who came close, who had all the talent in the world, but, for one reason or another, never quite reached the heights they were meant to? Do their stories deserve to be erased? Bojan's journey was not one of failure. It was a journey that exposed the ruthless nature of football, a journey that should serve as a lesson for every young player being labeled as the next big thing. His career is proof that talent alone is never enough. That football is not just about ability, but about resilience, mental strength, and being in the right place at the right time. That the pressure to succeed can destroy a player before he ever truly finds his rhythm. And yet, despite everything he went through, despite the weight he carried, despite the battles he fought in silence, Bojan Krkic still walked away with his head held high. Maybe he never reached the level the world expected of him. Maybe his name will never be spoken in the same breath as the legends of the game. But he was there. He lived it. He played for Barcelona, for Milan, for Roma. He scored goals, lifted trophies, wore the shirt of one of the greatest clubs in history. He experienced the beauty of football and its cruelty in equal measure. And maybe in the end that was enough. But as we look back at his story, we have to ask, why does football forget so quickly? Why do we celebrate young talents when they rise, only to abandon them when they fall? Why do players like Bojan Krkic disappear without a trace? Football is a game of moments. A single decision, a single match, a single season can change the course of a player's entire career. And for Bojan Krkic, the cruelest part of his story is the question that will always linger. What could have been? What if things had gone differently? What if the pressure hadn't been unbearable? What if he had made the right choices at the right times? Would we be talking about him in the same breath as Messi, Ronaldo, Neymar? Players who not only had the talent, but also had the right circumstances to reach greatness? Football has seen countless wonder kids rise and fall, but few had the kind of explosive start Bojan had. The difference is that most players who fail to live up to the hype never had the raw ability to truly be special. Bojan did. The biggest what if of all is Barcelona. What if he had stayed? What if he had fought for his place in a team that would go on to become one of the greatest in football history. When he left, he was still young, still full of potential. Would Guardiola have found a way to make him fit? Would he have matured alongside Messi, Xavi, and Iniesta, learning from their experience, growing into the world-class player everyone believed he would be? What if Barcelona had been more patient with him, easing him into the squad rather than throwing him into the fire at such a young age? Could he have thrived if the club had shielded him from the suffocating expectations, rather than allowing the media to define him before he had even played a full season? Some believe that leaving Barcelona was the fatal mistake, that his career was doomed the moment he stepped away from the club that had nurtured him since childhood. Others argue that he never truly had a chance, that Barcelona's system was too demanding, that the pressure of replacing legends was too much for anyone to handle, that no matter how talented he was never given the freedom to develop at his own pace, without being compared to one of the greatest players in history. But what if the real issue wasn't Barcelona at all? What if his downfall wasn't physical, but mental? Imagine a world where football understood mental health in the way it does today, where a 17-year-old suffering from anxiety attacks wouldn't be left to battle his demons alone, where psychological support was treated with the same importance as tactical training or physical conditioning. Would Bojan have survived the weight of expectations? Would he have been given the tools to manage his emotions, to thrive under pressure rather than crumble beneath it? Would a club like Barcelona, with all its resources, have found a way to help him overcome the suffocating fear that had started to consume him? The football world was not ready for a player like Bojan. It celebrated his talent but ignored his struggles. It praised his records but failed to recognize the signs that something was wrong. The pressure was not just external. It became internalized, a burden that grew heavier with every passing season. Every match where he didn't shine, every goal he didn't score, every time he stepped onto the pitch and didn't dominate the way Messi did, it all chipped away at his confidence. And confidence, more than anything, is what separates a star from a forgotten talent. Many of his former teammates have spoken about him in interviews, always with a sense of sadness, a feeling that Bojan could have been so much more. Players who trained with him, who saw his talent up close, have no doubts about his potential. He was different, special, a player who, if things had gone just slightly differently, could have been playing in Champions League finals, winning titles, competing for the Ballon d'Or. But football isn't just about ability. It's about mentality, opportunity, resilience. And Bojan, for all his talent, never found the right balance between those elements. Was Bojan Krkic's fate sealed from the start? Was he simply destined to struggle under pressure, unable to handle the weight of expectation? Or was he a victim of bad timing, bad decisions, and a system that never truly supported him? If he had been born 10 years later, into a footballing world where mental health is taken seriously, where young players are given more time to develop without being labeled as the next superstar before they are ready, could his story have had a different ending? Would Bojan have been another Iniesta, a player who matured into greatness under the right conditions? Would he have been a different kind of star, carving his own legacy rather than being forced to live in Messi's shadow? Or would he have still suffered the same fate? Another name in the long list of football's greatest what-ifs. And what does his story say about football today? We still see young players being hyped as the next big thing, still see the pressure mount on them before they even reach their 20s. Have we actually learned anything? Or is Bojan's story bound to repeat itself? With new names, new talents, and the same tragic outcomes? Now it's your turn. Was Bojan Krkic truly given a fair chance? Or was he another victim of a football machine that builds young stars only to discard them when they don't meet impossible expectations? If you've made it this far, don't forget to hit like, because the next story we're about to tell might be even more shocking. Football is a sport of triumph, but also of tragedy. For every player who reaches the top, there are countless others who never fulfill their potential, who fade into the background, their stories lost in the relentless cycle of the game. Bojan Krkic was supposed to be different. He was supposed to be a legend, a name that echoed through generations. But instead, he became a warning. His career, once destined for greatness, became a symbol of how ruthless football can be, how quickly the sport builds idols only to discard them when they fall short. For years, mental health in football was a subject no one wanted to discuss. Players were expected to be warriors, to endure the pressure, to never show weakness. Anxiety, depression, panic attacks. These were not things a footballer could admit to suffering from without being seen as fragile, unfit for the demands of the elite game. Football was a world where only the strongest survived, where emotions were seen as distractions, and where admitting vulnerability was considered a sign of failure. Bojan Krkic was one of the first high-profile cases to expose just how damaging this mindset could be. When he finally spoke about his struggles, it was shocking. A player who had been hailed as Barcelona's next superstar, who had broken records at a young age, was revealing that the very thing that had made him famous was also destroying him from the inside. He talked about the panic attacks, the overwhelming fear, the pressure that made him feel like he was suffocating. And as he spoke, the world began to realize something that had been ignored for too long. Talent is never enough if the mind is not prepared for the weight that comes with it. His story forced football to ask difficult questions. How many other players had suffered in silence? How many careers had been ruined by the pressure, not because of a lack of skill, but because the mental toll was too much to bear? How many young players were fighting their own internal battles, pretending to be fine because that's what was expected of them? And more importantly, why was there no system in place to protect these young athletes before it was too late? Bojan's struggle was not an isolated case. Football has always been a sport that demands perfection at an unforgiving pace. From the moment a player shows potential, they are placed under the microscope, their every move analyzed, their every weakness exposed. They are turned into commodities, their careers mapped out before they even understand what they truly want for themselves. The expectations are suffocating. Clubs, sponsors, media outlets, and even fans all contribute to an environment where failure is not an option. And when these young players crack under the pressure, they are replaced and forgotten. Since Bojan's downfall, the conversation around mental health in football has changed. Clubs have started investing in psychological support. Players now have access to sports psychologists, to resources designed to help them manage the pressure of competing at the highest level. Mental health is no longer seen as a weakness. It is recognized as an essential part of performance. But is it enough? Even the biggest stars in the world have spoken out. Andres Iniesta, one of the greatest midfielders of all time, has openly discussed his battle with depression. How even after winning the World Cup, he felt empty inside. Jesse Lingard has talked about how the mental strain nearly ended his career. Dani Olmo, a rising Spanish star, has emphasized the importance of mental preparation in the modern game. Even Lionel Messi, the very man Bojan was compared to, has admitted to struggling with the weight of expectations. These stories are becoming more frequent. The stigma is beginning to fade, but football is still far from truly solving the problem. Bojan's career serves as a reminder that football is still a machine, a business that values results above all else. For every club that implements mental health programs, there are still countless others that expect players to simply toughen up. For every young talent that receives proper psychological guidance, there are others who are thrown into the spotlight without any support, left to fend for themselves in a world that will discard them the moment they show weakness. Football remains a cutthroat industry, where the difference between success and failure is razor thin. For every Messi or Ronaldo, there are hundreds of Bojans, players with the talent but not the right circumstances, players who needed support that never came, players who could have been legends but instead became footnotes. So we have to ask, are we really learning from cases like Bojan Krkic, or are we just waiting for the next tragedy to unfold? The next Bojan is out there right now, a young player, carrying the weight of impossible expectations, trying to live up to the hype. Will football protect him, or will the same cycle repeat itself? Football is a game of endless debates. Every match sparks arguments. Every player is analyzed. Every career is judged in a million different ways. And Bojan Krkic's story is no different. Some see him as a victim, a player crushed under the weight of impossible expectations. Others believe he had every opportunity but lacked the mentality to seize them. But what do you think? Was Bojan Krkic a victim of the system? A young player thrown into the spotlight too soon, forced to carry the burden of being the next Messi before he even had time to develop? The pressure on his shoulders was something few players in history have ever faced. He was compared to one of the greatest of all time before he had even played a full season. He wasn't just expected to succeed, he was expected to dominate, to rewrite history, to be the future of Barcelona. But how can anyone live up to those expectations? The mental weight was suffocating, and in the end it broke him. Was his downfall inevitable from the start? Or did Bojan sabotage his own career? He had the talent, he had the opportunities, and yet, when the moment came, he couldn't handle it. Every player in football faces pressure. Every star is scrutinized, every mistake magnified, and yet, the best overcome it. Messi, Ronaldo, Neymar. They all faced impossible expectations. They were all called the future at a young age, but they thrived. They embraced the pressure, used it to fuel them. Bojan, on the other hand, let it consume him. Did he fail because of the system around him, or because he wasn't mentally strong enough to succeed at the top? And what about football itself? Does the game destroy young talents before they ever have the chance to succeed? How many players have we lost to the weight of expectation? How many wonder kids have disappeared, unable to live up to the hype? Is the system built to break these young athletes, to push them to their limits before they even understand who they are as players, as people? This is not just about Bojan. This is about all the players who were labeled as the next big thing before they even had time to grow. The media, the fans, the clubs, everyone demands instant greatness. If a young player isn't a superstar by the time they turn 21, they are cast aside, discarded, forgotten. But how fair is that? Think about the pressure these young players face. Every performance is analyzed under a microscope. Every mistake is headline news. Every dip in form leads to questions about whether they were ever really good enough in the first place. How can a teenager, still developing physically and mentally, be expected to handle that level of scrutiny? For Bojan, it started too soon. He wasn't just a young player with potential. He was a phenomenon, a prodigy, a player Barcelona was supposed to build their future around. But how much of that expectation was realistic? Could any player truly live up to being called the next Messi? Football is filled with wonder kids who never became legends. Freddie Adu, Ravel Morrison, Alexander Pato, Hachem Mastour. The list goes on and on. Different players, different backgrounds, but the same outcome. Players who were supposed to rule the game, but, for one reason or another, never reached the heights expected of them. But is it fair to call them failures? Or were they simply victims of a system that builds young players up only to tear them down the moment they show weakness? What if Bojan had been developed differently? What if he had been protected from the media circus, allowed to grow at his own pace, instead of being thrown into the spotlight? What if he had been treated like a teenager instead of being asked to carry the expectations of an entire club? And what if mental health had been taken seriously back then? Bojan himself admitted that his panic attacks were misunderstood, that people around him didn't know how to help him. Would his career have been different if football had treated mental struggles the same way it treats physical injuries? Even today, the sport still struggles to handle mental health properly. Young players continue to break under the weight of expectation. For every player who makes it, there are countless others who disappear, unable to cope with the pressure of elite football. The system is still flawed. The machine still demands too much, too soon. So now it's your turn. We want to hear from you. Was Bojan Krkic a lost talent? A player who never reached his full potential because of the world around him? Or was he the only one responsible for his own downfall? Did he have the ability to be one of the greats, but lack the mentality to get there? And most importantly, is football truly learning from stories like his? Or are we doomed to watch history repeat itself over and over again? Let us know in the comments. We're reading everything. Football is full of stories that defy belief. Tales of incredible rise and devastating falls, of players who were meant to rule the game, but ended up fading into the shadows. Bojan Krkic's story is one of football's greatest paradoxes. A player who had everything needed to succeed but never truly found his place. From his record-breaking rise at La Masia to his slow descent into obscurity, his career is a reflection of how brutal football can be, how talent alone is never enough, and how mental battles can be far more destructive than physical injuries. Even now, looking back, there are no easy answers. Was he failed by the system? Was he thrown into the spotlight too soon? Expected to carry a burden no teenager should have to bear? Could Barcelona have handled his development differently, protected him from the suffocating expectations, given him time to grow at his own pace, instead of forcing him into a role he wasn't ready for? Or was this fate unavoidable? Was Bojan simply not built for the highest level? Did the mental weight of elite football expose cracks that would have surfaced no matter where he played? There are players who thrive under pressure, who turn expectations into fuel and rise to the challenge. And then there are those who, no matter how much talent they possess, struggle to handle the relentless nature of professional football. Bojan Krkic was never a failure. He was a victim of something bigger than himself. An industry that demands greatness without mercy, that elevates young talents without preparing them for what comes next. And when those talents fall short, football doesn't wait for them. It moves on, leaving them behind. But maybe his story isn't just about what was lost. Maybe it's also about what we've learned. Because the next Bojan is out there right now, a young star, being hailed as the future, carrying expectations he may not be ready for. The question is, will football handle him differently this time? Or will we see this story repeat itself again? So if you think you've seen the worst of what football can do to its young stars, think again. This next story will leave you speechless. Click on the video that is appearing to watch it now, and prepare to be shocked.